The bookish internet is ablaze with controversy around author Ava Reid's newest release, Innamorata. I personally have never read any of Ava Reid's works. This is my first time diving in, but I kept hearing more and more about this controversy, and because it is tied to two genres I love very dearly and a concept I feel very protective over, I was paying a lot of attention, and I eventually just got to the point where I thought, you know what, I just have to read this myself because I don't know what to think. I need to read the book to know why people are so upset and to see if I can understand the huge reaction I'm seeing. Ava Reid's newest release is being described in so many different ways depending on who you talk to. Innamorata is either a romantasy, gothic horror, dark fantasy, grimdark, gothic fantasy, dark romance, or some combination of the above. No one seems to agree, and also lots of people are very angry. And because Innamorata seems to live within the realm of genres that I read most often, meaning fantasy and horror, and I'm also someone who really cares about content warnings. I advocate for their use, I share them every time I do a review, I try to encourage others to share content warnings, and I would really love to see content warnings become standard in the industry because, as I love to remind people, it's very easy to skip content warnings if you have no interest, but for those who need them or prefer them, it can make a huge difference to their reading experience and to their mental health in general. To have them available in a standardized place and to know that they are coming from the absolute best source, the author who wrote the actual content into the book, who knows exactly what is there and to what degree and how graphic it may or may not be. That is the absolute best way to do it. It doesn't put the burden on those who need them to search countless reviews, trying to avoid spoilers within the reviews themselves, but looking for indications of the content, or going to something like Storygraph, which can be fantastic, but is still sourced from readers, is going to depend on the reader's perspective, and depending on the book, if it hasn't been reviewed many times, might have no information. Additionally, because I would hope that it would prevent witch hunts for authors deciding whether to or not to include content warnings in their books. My understanding is that the reasoning Ava Reid has given for not providing content warnings for Innamorata, despite the apparently dark and graphic content, is that she provided content warnings on a previous work and received death threats for the content warnings. Death threats are never okay. I do not condone the use of death threats. Don't send death threats to anyone, literally ever, for anything. Don't do it. But also, I don't think that the answer to people being upset about the content in your books is to just not warn people about the content in your books next time. Because if you're still going to write dark content, but now there's no warning, you will presumably get more people reading your book without knowing the kind of content they're going to get, and then you'll probably have more people who are upset because they read content that they didn't want to read, that they didn't think they were signing up for. Now again, hopefully none of those people will send death threats because what's wrong with you people? But again, I'm not sure that that is the answer. It seems like it might make it worse. And I guess all this controversy is maybe indicating that it does. The conversation around this book is not just about whether it's good or bad. It is so much about categorization, about genre labels, about marketing, and about how to do so accurately when none of these labels or genres have hard and fast definitions. And when talking about a book that maybe bridges multiple genres and isn't so easily defined. It's also about what a book is promising to its readers by the author's previous works, by the title, by the cover, by the blurb, and by how people talk about it. Let me read the description for you off of the publisher's website. This book was published by Del Rey, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. So I'm on the book's official page on Penguin Random House's website. This is the book description. New York Times bestseller, a decadently dark gothic fantasy for readers who love haunting atmospheres, morally tangled characters, and stories where love becomes doom. So first of all, nowhere do I see the word horror included there. I've seen some people in this debate online in some of these conversations saying that it was obvious and always clear that this was a horror novel. On the sidebar on the right, I see related genres saying epic fantasy and gothic and horror. So it might be related to those things, but it seems to not be saying that it is officially part of either of those genres. It's not claiming to be gothic and horror or epic fantasy. But the actual words that the publisher is using to describe this book is a decadently dark gothic fantasy. To me, that doesn't read like a horror novel. Decadently dark can mean so many things. It's very vague. And gothic fantasy can also mean many things. You can have gothic fantasy without having explicit body horror and really gory, disturbing scenes, which is what I've heard is included in this book. Can't speak to that just yet, but I will find out very soon. Then we get a quote from author Jacqueline Carey. "Gorgeously gruesome, reads like the gory bones of a forgotten folktale." So here in this quote, we get gruesome and gory, so that gives us an indication. But again, there are no content warnings officially listed anywhere, so we don't really know what that's referring to. And again, gruesome and gory, pretty vague. What one person considers to be gruesome and gory is going to be very different from another. I probably have a higher bar than a lot of fantasy readers because I read so much horror, but I also don't have as high of a bar for those things as people who read more extreme horror than I read. So that can mean so many different things to different people. Then we get the blurb. "Once there was an island where the dead walked the earth, and 7 noble houses ruled by the arcane secrets of necromancy." Necromancy is another point, because necromancy tends to imply maybe some body horror type things, maybe some interactions with a corpse. I mean, necromancy doesn't automatically mean something incredibly disgusting. I've read books with necromancy that are very tame and really don't get into too much gory detail. "A conqueror's blade brought them low, burning their libraries, killing their lords, and extinguishing their eldritch magic. But defiant against the new order stands the House of Teeth and its last living members, beautiful Marozia, the heiress to the house, and her cousin, the uncanny Lady Agnes. Though she has not spoken a word in 7 years, Agnes is the true carrier of the house's legacy, and she has her orders. She must recapture the secrets of death magic and avenge her family's fallen honor. She must arrange the betrothal of her beloved cousin Marozia to Leoprand, heir to the conqueror's throne, for access to the forbidden library in his grotesquely grand castle. Revenge burns in Agnes's heart, but so do stranger passions, and it is Leoprand, the Golden Prince, who speaks to her soul. This passion is as treasonous as it is powerful, poisoning the kingdom's roots and threatening to tear the already shattered realm in two. For Agnes's final order is the gravest. She must not fall in love." And this is book 1 in the House of Teeth duology. Now, first of all, the duology is called House of Teeth, so that maybe indicates that there might be some body horror. Who knows? Depends on how creeped out you are by teeth. I personally get pretty icked out by teeth. Got some tooth-related trauma, as I have vaguely referred to in the past. But again, not necessarily something super grotesque. Who knows? Who knows? Now, me reading that blurb, to me, that reads like a dark romantasy. It's really focused on forbidden love. The last line of the blurb is she must not fall in love. That's the most important thing. She's in love with the wrong person. That seems like it's going to be a big part of the story. And it does seem kind of dark and forbidden, but the description doesn't make it seem like it's going to be all that gruesome or disgusting. It doesn't really warn of anything to that nature, in my opinion. I think the most explicit warning we get is through the author quote from Jacqueline Carey, but again, it's pretty vague. Honestly, reading that blurb, I probably wouldn't pick this book up because I would assume it was a dark romance in fantasy skin, which is not typically my genre. I am not surprised that people read that blurb and thought romantasy. Now, does it actually say romantasy on it anywhere? No. So maybe they were wrong to assume that. But again, I'm not surprised people would read it that way based on the way it was written. And apparently, maybe not directly from the author or the publisher, I have seen no indication that either of those parties have listed this explicitly as romantasy. But I have seen many readers claim that they saw fellow readers and reviewers label it as romantasy. I don't know if those readers had read it or not, but it was out there in the ether being spread around. So there are people picking this up, thinking it might be romantasy, and reading that blurb, I don't think there's anything there to dissuade them of that notion. And I do think it's fair for readers to talk about their experiences with the book and the ways that their expectations were not met, that they felt misled by how a book was sold to them. I've certainly had those experiences in the past, and it can be very frustrating as a reader. But I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments about mismarketing in general and whether we think that publishers are just kind of terrible at describing what books really are, or if there is a little bit of manipulation going on. Are publishers trying to describe books closer to really popular genres to try to push more sales, whether they are actually accurately describing the book or not? Because I have seen some people claim or surmise or theorize that the publisher was intentionally trying to attach this book to the romantasy craze to sell more books, knowing that it was not romantasy. I mean, I guess once books are purchased, you've made your money. But to me, that seems like a terrible marketing strategy because the people who read the book are not going to enjoy it if it is not the genre you have claimed it to be. And they might not be as willing to trust this author or this publisher again in future. But maybe they don't care about that. Let me know your thoughts in the comments about that. Also, please let me know your thoughts on content warnings and whether you agree with me that they should be just standardized. We should just expect them to exist in every book. They're always in the same positioning right after the copyright page. You can easily skip them if you don't want them, but those who want them know that they can consistently have a content warning list written by the person who wrote the book and knows exactly what is in the book and what should be flagged. The last thing I want to bring up is whose responsibility is this? Because I am seeing the anger, the vitriol landing at Ava Reid's feet. And is it really Ava Reid's responsibility how her book is being marketed and reviewed and recommended, and whether or not their book has content warnings? Is that entirely in their control? Or is this something that the publisher should be responsible for? Is this something people should be calling out the publisher for? Should their ire be directed at the publisher and not Ava Reid? Or is it a blend of both? Because I personally have not seen anyone getting angry at the publisher about this. I'm sure some people are. I have not seen those comments or those posts or those videos. I have seen people very upset at Ava Reid. And I know on some level there's a psychological thing going on where it's easier to blame the person who has a face and a name, who you can call out specifically. But I do think it's interesting looking at some of the other author controversies recently where I question whose responsibility it really was. And in other cases also recently, I'm thinking of situations like with Mia Ballard with Shy Girl, there's a lot of ire for the author and very little calling out the publisher. And in both cases, I'm thinking the publisher has a much bigger role to play than it seems like people want to acknowledge. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. Just share some of your initial thoughts in the comments before we get into the book itself and find out what we find out about what the content actually is. I have read the first chapter already. In a minute, I'm going to jump into the past so you can see me reading the first chapter, and then I will share my thoughts. As always, I will aim to keep my commentary as spoiler-free as possible and keep spoilers to separate sections that you will be warned about ahead of time so you can skip them. Check out the description box for timestamps so you can use those chapters to skip over the spoiler section very quickly and easily. But let's jump back into the past when I was reading the first chapter, preparing to make this video, and then I will share my thoughts on this first chapter and what it indicates about what this book is going to be moving forward. I'm sure you noticed the super sci-fi looking mask I was wearing in those reading clips. That mask is from this video's sponsor, Foreo. I've been using my FAQ 202 LED mask from Foreo for several months now, and I absolutely love it. I noticed such a palpable change in my skin when I entered my 30s, and for a while there, I did not know what to do. I didn't know how to fix it, and then I learned about the amazing benefits of LED therapy, especially for anti-aging. And the amazing thing about Foreo's FAQ 202 LED mask is that it's so easy to use at home. It's made of a light, flexible silicone, and it's wireless, so it's really lightweight and comfortable to wear around the house while I'm doing my treatments. The mask has 8 different LED wavelengths, including NIR, 600 points of light placed in optimal locations on the mask, which ensures that the LED wavelengths penetrate the skin evenly. The mask also gently warms the skin, which temporarily dilates your pores so the LED can enter the skin more efficiently. It also just feels really nice. I've always looked up to my mom when it comes to skincare. She was my idol. She has amazing skin and she taught me everything I know about skincare. One thing I will never forget that she taught me from an early age is that consistency is key. And the FAQ 202 LED mask makes it so easy to stay consistent because it's so convenient and easy to use. All I do is apply a little bit of Foreo's FAQ red light peptide serum on clean skin because it accelerates and amplifies the LED therapy. Then I just pop on the mask, turn it on, and connect it to the Foreo app, and either run one of their pre-made treatments or choose my own adventure with the specific wavelengths and intensities of light that I want to use that day to treat whatever skin concern is top of mind. And for me personally, my main skin concerns at this stage of life are number one, breakouts, but I do find that using the FAQ 202 LED mask regularly a few times a week really helps with reducing how bad my breakouts are in general. They heal so much more quickly. Everything is just much more manageable. And my other main skin concern is just the quality of my skin in general. I feel like since entering my 30s, my skin just looks a little less plump. It's a little more dull and also more uneven. After doing a treatment, my skin is plump and feels even and bright. My redness is reduced a lot and my skin just looks happier. And after 5 to 15 minutes, I'm done. Take off the mask, spray it with Foreo's silicone cleaning spray and wipe it off, and plug it in to charge for next time. If you're looking for the perfect Mother's Day gift or just to treat yourself, Foreo is having amazing deals right now. Click the link in the description or scan the on-screen QR code, and don't forget to use my code BASED30 for an extra 30% off almost all products. And the code is also stackable on sale items, so it's an amazing deal, and thank you again to Foreo for sponsoring this video. Let's talk about the first chapter of Innamorata. There is a quote before we get to the first chapter, and that quote is, "He had emptied the bright goblet of romance. At a single gulp he had emptied it. The glass of it lay scattered on the floor." Again, talking about romance right off the bat. Wouldn't be surprised if for people reading that leads them to believe that they are in fact reading a romantasy. The glass being scattered on the floor doesn't necessarily indicate to me anything particularly dark or gory. Just seems like maybe this romance is not going to be easy breezy. Cover girl. Then we have the prologue, which is a single paragraph. "It was the castle of Nicephorus the Sluggard, and before that it had been the castle of Widsith the Precious, and before that Berengar who fights alone, and before that the island of Derpain had no king, no duke, no count, and only death lay upon the marshes and peaks and sickly white beaches until blood watered the earth and the great monument flowered up, stone upon cruel stone." So we do have mentions of death and blood and cruelty in the prologue. But again, I would say as someone who reads more fantasy than any other genre, most fantasy I have ever read in my entire life, including fantasy aimed at children, has death and cruelty and blood in it in some capacity, to some degree. So again, this doesn't to me say I'm about to read a really dark, disturbing horror novel. Feels again like it could work as darker fantasy, gothic fantasy, or again, a darker romantasy. Then we get into the first official chapter, and I won't consider this spoilers because it is literally the first chapter of the book. What happens in the first chapter is not spoilers, okay? Feel free to argue with the wall if you think that they are, but this first chapter is the description of the desecration of a dead body. This is Agnes's grandmother, and this is her funeral or a death rite ritual, and said ritual involves various people approaching the body in the mud and the muck and removing parts of her body, for example, all of her blood or all of her bones or her eyes or her teeth, one at a time, until the body is essentially an empty husk, and then the last person approaches and stomps her body into the mud until there is essentially nothing left. And that is our first chapter. Now, that is a little bit more dark than I typically would experience in fantasy. I will give it that. But I will say that, again, I have read fantasy where this would not be out of place. I also don't think the descriptions are particularly gruesome or graphic. I will find an example for you. This tube at first hung as the limp cord of pig viscera that it was, until the leech blew into it and it inflated at once, as rigid as a man-at-arms. The other end was then fixed into a glinting metal spigot, hardly larger than a sewing needle, but much sharper. This pierced the flaccid throat of Adele Blanche. Given that the pig viscera tube was translucent, all the attendants could clearly observe Adele Blanche's blood sluicing from her veins and into the fluted vessel. It was rather pulpy, and each time the tube clogged, one of the leeches flicked it with a single finger, the way one might repel a horsefly. A curious thing occurred as the blood dripped into the vessel, though it happened inside Agnes's mind, where no one else could see. All of a sudden the blood became a quotidian liquid, like bath water or soup broth. The blood was not her grandmother was gone. We proceed to get more descriptions like his baldness shone like the back of the silver spoon his leeches used to scoop out Adele Blanche's eyes. Is that gruesome? Sure. I think most people would agree that the concept of scooping out someone's eyes with spoons, pretty gruesome, even if they're already dead. That being said, that description to me is not gruesome. It's not explicit, it's not gory, it's not very descriptive at all. It doesn't talk about all the mechanics that would have to be involved for that to happen and how gross that would probably actually be to watch. It's pretty brief, happens pretty fast, not described in detail. It doesn't even describe her sockets after the fact and what they look like. To me, that's not very explicit or gory. That being said, someone else who reads different books or has a different tolerance threshold to me might read that and find it very disturbing. I think it will depend on the reader. This entire first chapter proceeds like that, and none of it to me indicates something that I'm going to find particularly disturbing in content. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe in one of these future check-ins, I'm going to check in and be so disturbed and disgusted and shocked. Personally, I don't think this first chapter is completely shocking and disturbing. I do think some people might read this first chapter and immediately nope right out. And I do think some of those people maybe would have just not picked up the book in the first place if there were content warnings indicating some of the things happening in this first chapter. But of course, there would still be readers falling through the cracks who either wouldn't have looked at the content warnings or would look at them, think, I can handle that, and then read this first chapter and actually think it was too much for them. That can, of course, still happen because content warnings are still relatively vague. They kind of have to be by necessity. So would it solve every problem? No. Do I think content warnings would help even for the content in this first chapter, even though for me this is not particularly disturbing or gory or graphic? Yes. What I would say my impression is after reading this first chapter is that I am going into a fantasy that is trying to give us a darker, moodier atmosphere, that we are going to have a little bit more casual violence or blood and gore, not super vividly described, but that it's going to be ubiquitous throughout the story, that this is a little bit of an edgier fantasy. I do not read this first chapter and think I'm getting horror, nor do I read this first chapter and think that I'm going to be shocked or disturbed by any of the content to come. The last thing I want to say about this first chapter that has nothing to do with the controversy, but is just my reaction to this as a book and my first experience reading Ava Reid's work, is that I am not a fan of this prose so far. This feels to me like prose that is trying very hard to be atmospheric and aesthetic and poetic and lyrical, and doing so at the expense of communicating its ideas to the reader, making things more convoluted and complex and confusing than they have to be, and also semi-regularly using metaphors and similes that don't really make sense in the context of the sentence and don't add anything to what's being said. I will read a couple examples for you so that you know what I'm reacting to. The very first thing is that the first line of chapter 1 is, "No corpse would be left to lie long enough for maggots, but there were leeches. There must be leeches." And leeches is just, written normally as the word leeches would be written, lowercase. Me reading this, my assumption, because I know what leeches are, is that this is referring to leeches, like the animal, because why would it not be referring to leeches? It's saying leeches. Turns out that leeches actually refers to a position that human people hold in this society, like a job title, but it's not capitalized and it's not explained at any point. Eventually, you just kind of figure it out after the leeches are described as standing about with arched backs, their spines compressed like a snake before it strikes, me wondering if leeches can stand. Eventually, it becomes clear that the leeches are people, but it's never explained. I find that annoying. I feel like that's just unclear unnecessarily. Even just capitalizing the word leeches would have helped and made it clearer that it is a position or a role and not the literal animal. But they also could have been more clearly described early on so that I knew that it was people, instead of reading so long trying to figure out how any of this made sense with actual leeches until I realized that in fact they are people. So there are things like that. Then we have the most esteemed surgeon, who is intoning, "This woman is dead, expired, extinct, forever gone," which feels deeply redundant and also like he's rubbing it in just a little bit. My initial impression would be to think that this was a characterization choice, that this character is supposed to be blustery and wordy and pompous and so on, and he's repeating himself so many times, being very overdramatic. But then we get this. "When his voice reached Agnes's ears, it fizzled like water dissolving on a hot pan into steam and nothingness. Her mind generated its own words to fill the space." And again, why that imagery? It fizzled like water dissolving on a hot pan. First of all, water doesn't really dissolve on a hot pan. It evaporates. But regardless, that just feels like an unnecessarily wordy description. And again, it just ties into a lot of the writing choices that were starting to stand out to me in not the most positive way. "May you be consumed as a coal upon the hearth. May you dry up as water in a pail. May you become as small as a linseed grain, and much smaller than the hip bone of an itch mite. And may you become so small that you become nothing." Very redundant, repetitive, some silly comparisons there. It's all very long-winded and meandering, and again, repeating it so many times to me doesn't add any depth. It just feels like we're circling this idea unnecessarily, wasting time. It feels a little overwrought, is how I'll put it. We also get lines like this. "Her grandmother was gone, but just as suddenly as the realization occurred to her, with all its lovely weightlessness, it vanished again. Her grandmother's posthumous existence, that awareness, that truth that even in death she was not truly gone, dropped down upon her shoulders like a hissing, heavy house cat." And again, that simile to me doesn't fit the situation. Everything up to this point has been very plodding and lugubrious and labored and slow. They keep talking over and over again about these leeches getting stuck in the mud and barely pulling themselves out. Everything is slow and wet and dreary and heavy. And then the imagery here, hissing heavy house cat, which having cats at home and seeing them upset and hissing, they are chaotic and fast and claws, teeth, blood, mayhem. And to me, nothing about this passage calls for that kind of imagery, and I don't think it really makes sense in the context. And again, it feels like the imagery is being prioritized over the actual communication of meaning to the reader, which I think could be described as purple prose, focusing on the aesthetic over communication. I love beautiful writing. I love lyrical writing. I do not love writing that is more interested in sounding fancy than it is in telling a story. And this is just the first chapter, so I don't know yet, but I was starting to get frustrated even just reading this first chapter. We get descriptions like, "The mud sucked lecherously at their boots." I don't feel that that word is the appropriate word to use in that context. I realize that it has other connotations that perhaps Ava Reid was trying to pull in at this point, but mud can't technically be lecherous, and I'm just not sure why we would need to describe it that way when there are so many other words you could use. Later on, we get, "Agnes stared down at the increasingly lugubrious mud." The mud is being described more than almost anything else. Then we get this paragraph that starts with, "Perhaps she made too much of the House of Blood's absence. Perhaps it was no more than coincidence." So she, maybe she's overthinking it. Maybe it's just a coincidence, But then the paragraph ends with, "It was hard to deny the overtness of this breach of etiquette." So is it an overt breach of etiquette that you cannot deny? Or are you perhaps making too much of it and it is perhaps a coincidence? Because those two things don't really align, They seem pretty inherently contradictory. Then we move on to the next paragraph where we apparently are not done with this back and forth constant questioning of whether it's intentional or not. "Still, she did think it must be directed at the crown, if it was indeed an insult." Again, we're just going back and forth. Could it be a coincidence? No, it must be overt and direct. Why? Why are we going back and forth so many times? Maybe this is meant to be characterization, that this character is really wishy-washy and doesn't know her own mind. But either way, I'm annoyed by going back and forth on this for so long. I don't even know much about the House of Blood at this point. I don't really care if anyone has been offended. I'm like 5 pages into this book. Just tell me if you think it's intentional or not, or maybe say that you're unsure if it's intentional and and move on. And I've said many times, books do not have to be as efficient as humanly possible to be good. Authors are allowed to waffle a little bit. I just think there is a line, and that line is going to be different for different people. But to me, this is crossing the line into just word salad, repeating things for no reason, reiterating things again and again. We've just barely started the book. I don't care yet. I don't care enough to go through these thought patterns again and again. Let's just move on. There's a lot of repetitive descriptions, I guess, for the aesthetic to make it feel fancy, that don't add anything new. He has journeyed through reeking swamps and up miserable cliffs, through the gloomy stench of mist, to the peak that upholds the peak. Cliffs are miserable, and mist is gloomy. Swamps are reeking, and the mist also has a stench as well as being gloomy. We get it again. We get it. Describing someone's curling beard as wry, you can, I guess. A little bit too much personification for facial hair, in my personal opinion. We also get as if to maintain some sort of filamentary equilibrium. The hair on his head was entirely gone. Filamentary equilibrium? Again, feels a little bit like overuse of a thesaurus. Nothing wrong with those words in isolation, but in this prose, they stand out as being a very different kind of vocabulary than is being used in general in this text. Again, we get so many descriptions of how the mud is lecherous and lugubrious. Here we get staggering out of the mud pit. A paragraph later, we get scrabbling out of the mud pit. We get it. It's hard to walk through the mud. How many times do we have to describe it? Again, I feel that the thing that was described the most in this whole chapter was the mud pit, which I can't think will be that important moving forward, but Ava Reid really wants me to understand how muddy and sticky the mud pit is. Very important for the vibes, I guess. We get a little story about Agnes's childhood in which she talks about accidentally crushing a bug. So then she knelt in the grass and smeared the juices of the insect's demise into the dirt. Which again, why so wordy? Smeared the juices of the insect's demise? Okay. When she stood up again, all evidence of its death was gone. Which I question, because just smearing the juices of a dead bug into the dirt does not make those juices disappear unless you smear it into the dirt and then like bury it. Is all evidence of its death gone, or did you just smear it into the dirt? Might seem like I'm nitpicking, but I do think it's important, especially if you're trying to write in a more lyrical, wordy style, to choose your words carefully. I find it frustrating when a book is really focused on the words and you can tell how much effort has been gone into the word choices, and I am being made hyper aware of the word choices because of the writing style, but then the word choices feel misplaced. And we end the first chapter with this passage, which again is mirroring the insect being smeared into the dirt. The most esteemed surgeon wore heavy wooden clogs, holding on to Swallow and Restbone. Those are names of people, they're capitalized. He stomped Adele Blanche's entrails into the mud, thudding, squelching like he was mashing grapes for wine, which is a weirdly humorous image to bring into this apparently gruesome scene, until the red matter of her grandmother was reduced to invisible bits and mixed with the dirt so as to be completely utterly irretrievable. So again, the imagery of mashing grapes for wine, again, makes it seem jovial and jolly and feels at odds with the tone of the chapter and this passage in particular. But also, was her grandmother reduced to invisible bits, or are the bits just mixed with the mud now so they're hard to see? Like, I guess they might be invisible to the naked eye now that they're so mixed in, or they're like buried in the mud. Okay. Irretrievable, yeah. If you've totally mixed what's left of her into the mud, it's going to be pretty hard to retrieve. But has she actually been crushed into such tiny particles that you couldn't identify and retrieve them if you really tried? Because there might be some like clumps. So that is the first chapter. Those are my thoughts. As you can tell, I'm not super impressed by the writing style. It's not really my personal taste. Maybe I will get more used to it as it goes on. Maybe the first chapter is really trying to be grand, and as it moves on, it will relax a little bit and it won't bug me so much. Maybe I'm just being too picky. I'm sure many of you think I am. I'm hoping that the writing shifts a little bit so that it's more to my taste, because I did find it a little painful to read the first chapter, I'm not gonna lie. I really didn't know what to expect going into this. Like I said, I've never read any Ava Reid. I was hoping I would enjoy the book regardless of how I might feel about the whole drama and where I would land at the end. I was hoping I would have a good time with the book, because I always go into books hoping that I will enjoy them. But it's not looking great right now, but I'm hoping that that can still change. Like I said though, in terms of how gory or gruesome it is, again, I read a lot of those passages to you. Did they feel super gruesome and gory to you? Maybe. Do I think that it's enough that probably content warnings would help for people who don't typically read books with even this level of body horror gruesomeness and might want to be warned before they go in, yes. But I also think literally every book should have content warnings, so that's a pretty low bar to cross. Again, though, reading that, I am not expecting horror. I'm not expecting anything that's going to gross me out or disturb me based on what I read. The physical copy is 560 pages, so not insignificant, pretty hefty, but I'm going to read to the quarter mark, stop as I get to chapter 24, Dissolve Through Death. So that is the next section I'm reading. If you're reading along with me, that's where we're reading to before I come back for my next check-in. And I'm not shocked by any of the content so far. I don't find it particularly gross or disturbing, but I do read horror, so that's where I'm coming from. Let's find out if that opinion changes. Okay, so I just finished chapter 23 of Innamorata. I'm just at the start of Dissolve Through Death, chapter 24. I'm 25% of the way through, and let's chat about what's happened so far. First of all, very little has happened, actually, in terms of plot. Our sisters have traveled to a different manor, and there was a wedding, and that's it. That's all that's happened. So that's where we're at. In terms of, content to make people uncomfortable, disturbed, upset, for the most part, I don't see it, to be honest. There is a little bit of death, a little bit of grossness. So far, all of it is pretty minor, in my opinion, and also not very graphically described. I just feel like I've read a lot of fantasy that's even more gory than this. Again, maybe it's coming later. I don't know. But so far, it's not getting to me. The only exception is, and this honestly, I would say if you could only choose one content warning to put on this book, at least so far, 25% of the way in, the one content warning I would give it is fat phobia. This might be the most fat phobic book I have ever read. And you can disagree with me if you want, but in my personal opinion, this is not a case of a flawed character who has messed up beliefs, and we as the reader are meant to view their beliefs as messed up, and the text itself is condemning the messed up beliefs. This book seems to be very heavily using body size as a shorthand for morality and self-control. And the main comparison here is between our protagonist, who is described as very thin and waif-like, and also is repeatedly described to have disordered eating patterns, to be very minimal in how much she eats, to be very controlled about how much she allows herself to eat, to keep herself intentionally hungry a lot of the time. And she is our protagonist. So she is the one that we are kind of forced to relate to root for narratively. She's definitely not framed as an anti-hero or an intentionally unlikable narrator. At least does not seem to be, from my perspective, the way that this is being framed, the way that the narrative is framing her. And then her foil, the comparison, is the king of their land, who is described in very fat-phobic language, made to seem grotesque because of his body, and also is just a crappy person who is a gross person because of his behavior, but it is constantly paired together, his body and his behavior, as if they are linked, which again is a fat phobic stereotype. And that comparison back and forth is happening frequently. Your perception may be different. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts if you've read this book. I had seen once or twice in reviews mentions of fat phobia, but I was not prepared for the extent of the fat phobia. Again, this might be the most fat phobic book I've ever read. I would not recommend this to anyone who is even remotely sensitive to fat phobia and fat phobic depictions of characters. I am really struggling to push through it. I honestly can't believe that this is a book coming out right now. And again, characters are allowed to be terrible people. Characters are allowed to, you're allowed to write a character who is fat phobic, and perhaps Ava Reid is trying to write Agnes, her protagonist, as fat phobic as a flaw. So far, there is nothing narratively to indicate that that is a flaw and not just the framework through which this story is being told. Shorthands to communicate to the reader that the thin character is morally superior and in control and has self-restraint, and that the fat character is morally despicable and corrupt. So far, that is the entire framing. And it is written in third person, so we're not entirely in Agnes's mind. There is a bit of a omniscient narrator going on, and through the narration, these characters are described this way as well. So again, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts if you've read this book, but for me, this is reading as a framework that the story is being told through, not an intentional choice to depict a flawed character with messed up beliefs. Maybe I will be proven wrong, and by the end of the book, she will realize the error of her ways, but I have not seen that indicated in any of the reviews that I've seen that have mentioned the fat phobia. I also have seen in the reviews that mentioned the fat phobia that this is not the first time that Ava Reid's books have had fat phobia. And again, I haven't read their other books, so I can't confirm that, but it does seem like it's a pattern between books, and that adds a little bit more weight to the feeling that I'm having, that this is not so much an intentional choice, but something that is maybe an unconscious bias. Or maybe an intentional choice, but an intentional choice to be fat phobic, which would really suck. And I prefer not to assume that authors are intentionally trying to write those kinds of messed up beliefs into their books. But again, it is really hard to read. It is really bad. It's really bad. I don't even want to read quotes to you, to be honest, because I don't want to say the words. They are really disgusting. Nobody should be described this way. Even terrible people should not have their bodies described in these kinds of ways. If you need details because you're trying to determine if you can read this or not, let me know and I can share a quote with you. But again, I really don't want to say it out loud because I find it really upsetting. To be honest, it was bad enough to read it. I don't want to have to repeat it. But other than the fat phobia, and also kind of tied to that, the fact that the main character seems to have some disordered eating habits, there's not really anything in this book that I would think heavily requires content warnings. Again, keeping in mind, we're on the same page that I literally think every book should have content warnings for all the things, because I think that that is a useful tool. And a book doesn't have to be really graphic for content warnings to be useful. But I'm just saying, I don't see what people are reacting to in this or what people are finding grotesque, disturbing, disgusting, other than the fat phobia. So that's where I'm at so far, 25% of the way through. Again, plot-wise, almost nothing has happened. In terms of the writing style and how that is continuing, it's not going well, friends. It's not going well. I don't want to make this video a million years long, so I'm not going to nitpick every single sentence, but the repetition in here is wild. How many times do we have to say posthumous existence? You'd think that twice or three times would be enough, but no, not for Ava Reid. Posthumous existence shows up 13 times in this novel. That is way too many times. It's come up 7 times so far in the first 25%. It's way too much. It's coming up so often, and pretty much every time she refers to her grandmother, she's referring to her grandmother's posthumous existence. Let me just read to you the 7 examples of this so far so that you understand how repetitively it is phrased, even outside of just the use again and again of posthumous existence. Her grandmother's posthumous existence, that awareness, that truth. Yet her posthumous existence woke Agnes like a knife in the dark. Her stubbornly posthumous existence gusted across her in a cold draft. Her grandmother's posthumous existence slid like a knife through her ribs. Second time that posthumous existence is being compared to a knife. Her grandmother's posthumous existence seemed to have been shut out of this place. Her grandmother's posthumous existence had pressed into her mind. And the final mention in the first 25%, her grandmother's posthumous existence that moved her quill. I feel like I don't have to say anything else. You get it. Also, quotidian being used a lot. Not nearly as much as posthumous existence, surprisingly. It's only used 10 times, but it has been used 5 times in the first 25%, and it really is very noticeable. Also, Ava Reid seems obsessed with the concept of epithets. King something the great, queen something the intelligent, the whatever, their title that they're known by, their epithet. Not only does epithet come up, let's see, 6, 12. The word epithet is actually used in the text 20 times. So not only is there an obsession with calling characters by their name and epithet, and also having Agnes daydream about possible epithets for this prince that she's met. She's constantly considering what his epithet will be, but also the word epithet itself, so calling attention to this device that she's using, comes up 20 times. And I feel like this is really a great way to depict how I'm feeling about the writing in general, which is that not only does it feel very repetitive and very overly constructed, but also it's written in such a way that it draws your attention to the effort that is being put into the writing. The writing is very effortful. It is incredibly overwrought. Often there are metaphors or similes and they're layered 3 or 4 deep, and they don't add anything the deeper you go. They're just repeating the same thing again and again, or sometimes contradicting themselves for some reason. Descriptions of Agnes's silence being one of the ways in which she is not intimidating, and then the next page, her silence is her greatest weapon. Or the author writes out 4 or 5 different versions of a metaphor or a simile in a situation, and then instead of choosing the best one, just uses all of them, which comes across not only deeply tedious to read, very repetitive and plotting, and we just never move forward because we're using as many metaphors and similes as we possibly can to describe literally every tiny thing that happens, but also it comes across self-conscious or anxious. Like Ava Reid doesn't trust themselves to choose the correct metaphor, simile, the right imagery for a situation, and so she uses every single possible one. It's not working for me. It's causing me to be hyper aware at all times that I am reading a book, that I'm reading words on a page that someone labored over. And it doesn't feel, not only does it not feel smooth and effortless and immersive as a story, it also just feels clunky. And again, it has this sort of self-conscious, insecure feeling to it. I find it very odd. I find it odd. It feels like I'm watching Ava Reid really strain for something profound and lyrical and gorgeous and just flounder. I also feel like this tendency to not edit anything out is causing the writing not only to feel incredibly overwrought and sort of cyclical and mired in its own weight and redundant, but also very imprecise because there are so many examples where the text is contradicting itself. A few more things. The world building is also pretty minimal so far. We are getting semi-regular info dumps for a little bit of history or a little bit of context for how the world works, but there are many things about the world that we do not know. And I am typically a person who appreciates rich world building in my fantasy, so that's not really working for me. I feel like there are so many intricacies about the political system and the religious systems and how they are interacting that are just not being addressed whatsoever. So that's a little frustrating for me as a reader. There's also a lot of using figurative language as if it's literal with no clarification at any point. So you're reading the text, and again, this is sort of setting itself up, as much as it's not actually that graphic so far, it's setting itself up as something that is dark and moody and gross. So then when you describe a character's eyes being boiled in their head, my assumption is, okay, wow, that character's eyes just got boiled. Sucks to be them. Turns out they weren't actually boiled. It was not literal, but it's written entirely as if it's literal. There's no context. There are no clues within the text that this isn't literally happening, except that in the next scene, when the character shows up, their eyes are clearly not boiled. That is frustrating as a reader because I don't know whether to trust what the text is telling me or not. And not in a fun fever dream, magical realism, or nightmarish kind of way, in the author is being very unclear about what's actually happening kind of way. Also, this text is obsessed with comparing Agnes and her cousin. We have to be reminded all the time that they are very different physically. Every single new character who meets them has to think about how different they are. again and again and again and again. Like, we get it. We know they look different. Thank you. Anyway, so there is a maid who meets them and she's looking at Agnes. She's thinking about how her beauty is different from her cousin's, because of course she is. And the quote is, "Her beauty was that of a corpse, gentle, lambent stillness." So you're saying she has the beauty of a corpse because she's pale and she's quiet. She doesn't speak. She is very, frail or waif-like. Describing her as gentle, which is kind of weird because on the last page, this character was going on and on about how Agnes's stillness was actually very sharp. And let me find the quote, actually. Also, sharp is used a lot. Anyway, Waltrude somehow had the sense of her silence as total. Even her eyes communicated nothing at all. And then a paragraph later, "Yet her silence could not be mistaken as deafness or muteness. There was nothing dull about it," which also to me reads as ableism. Anyway, it was a sharp-edged silence, bristling like barbs, as though she were trying to punish the world by withholding speech. So her silence is sharp-edged like barbs. And then later on that page, she describes her beauty was that of a corpse, death laid over her with its gentle, lambent stillness. So she's gentle now. She has the beauty of a corpse, this gentle quality, even though you were just describing her silence as sharp and barb-like. She's punishing the world by withholding her speech, but she's also gentle. And you're describing her as having a corpse-like beauty. She's very pale, she's very thin, she has this stillness to her, but you're describing it as a lambent stillness. Lambent is like a soft glow, which is how her cousin is described. Every time they're trying to compare them as very different, her cousin is described as having this like joyful, lifelike glow, but now apparently Agnes has a death-like glow. Again, I feel like choices are made because they sound good and not because they actually clearly communicate the ideas to the reader. What are you trying to say? There is a quote that describes feeling like a mantle made from the gaspings of ghosts, which again, I don't know what that imagery is supposed to evoke for me. Anyway, I will move on from nitpicking the prose. That's not what this video is supposed to be about. You get it. I'm not a fan so far. I do hope it improves, but I'm not holding my breath. The last thing I want to say before I go away and read more is that I 100% think that this, at least so far, is fair to be described as romantasy. I'm so sorry. This is not a horror novel. Again, unless things really change as the book continues, which is possible. So far, this is written like romantasy. It's written like an overwrought, overly lyrical romantasy. It has insta-love already. It has the trope of the not like other girls, not as beautiful as her cousin or her sister or her rival character, MC, and the perfect super hot prince or king or leader of whatever kind is immediately infatuated with her, but she doesn't understand why or can't pick up on it because she has no social skills whatsoever. And it's going to take her ages to realize that he's actually into her and not her beautiful sister or cousin or friend. Also indications of them being fated mates of some kind. There's a lot of talk about soulmates and other halves already. She's already thinking about how this character always sees her when they've met like 4 times, but he always sees her every time as if they've known each other forever. It reads like romantasy so far. It does. Does it have a bit of a dark, moody tone to it? Sure. That doesn't make it horror. I'm so confused by people calling this horror and saying it's nothing like romantasy. I get why people would be, at least in the first 25%, reading this and saying, oh yeah, it's described as a gothic or a dark fantasy. It talks a lot in the blurb about love. The first 25% reads like romantasy to me. Cool. And then if it goes off the rails later and gets really graphic and gory, which I'm expecting it to based on how people reacted to this, then I could understand people being thrown off, to be totally frank. Again, let me know your thoughts in the comments if you've read this, but I don't know. This reads like romantasy to me. Am I losing it? I don't know. I read a lot of horror. I read a lot of fantasy, and I try to dabble in romantasy semi-regularly because I keep trying to find my niche within the genre. Most recently, I read and reviewed and made videos on Brimstone by Callie Hart and The Everlasting by Alex E. Harrow. This is definitely reading more like the Brimstone type of romantasy than the Everlasting type of romantasy, but it doesn't read like horror to me personally. And again, nothing very gross or graphic on the page. And the most important content warning is for the fat phobia. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I will leave you with one more quote because this one made me angry. As the wife of a sound engineer who loves to talk about the science of sound, I'm certainly not an expert myself, but I know enough to know what I know. And this quote threw me off so hard. Our golden, beautiful boy, Prince, gives a little speech. And then we get this gem. When he spoke, the very air seemed to ripple and bend, as if it were nothing more than a conduit for his words, carrying them to the ears of each noble in the hall. As if air is not literally a conduit for sound waves, as if that's not how sound actually works. Like, sound literally travels through the air to your ears. That's how sound works on a scientific level. That's why there's no sound in space, because there's no air. There are no particles for the sound waves to vibrate, to I'm done. I'm done. I'm gonna go read to the 50% mark. Just keep in mind that if I were reading this just for my own enjoyment, entertainment, I would have DNF'd after the first really disgusting fatphobic description of the king. I'm continuing because I am trying to find the actual content that people are freaking out about. Maybe it is the fat phobia, but honestly, most of the reviews I've seen are not specifically calling out fat phobia. Some of them are, but a lot of them seem to be upset about something else. So I feel like there is something else coming. And I already set out on this journey and I want to know the answer. So I'm gonna keep going, but yeah, just keep in mind, this would have been a DNF otherwise for the fat phobia. I do not recommend entirely because of the fat phobia. That is enough for me to never recommend this to anyone. I was literally just on FaceTime with my sister and my nephew telling her to never pick this up because I know she would hate it because of the fat phobia. But that's where we're at. I'm gonna go read to the 50% mark and I'll be back and we'll see what we see. That's literally how sound works. Okay, I'm done. I'm done. I'm done. I promise. Hello, I'm back. I'm halfway through Innamorata at the start of book 2, which is 52% of the way through, but I hit 50% in the middle of a chapter, so I finished the chapter. None of my opinions have changed. I will do a spoiler section for this because I do have a couple things to comment on that are, I would say, pretty major spoilers, so I'll do that. But in terms of all the different points that I'm kind of tracking, plot-wise, still very little has happened, even though we're halfway through the book. I think 2 more major events have happened. The plot is going slowly. Character development, we made a little bit of progress, but also kind of regressed. 1 step forward, 2 steps back with this characterization. And the writing style is still irking me. To be honest, I really tried to stop paying such close attention because it was starting to piss me off. So I don't have as many nitpicky notes on the writing. It's all the same issues. It's the same multi-layered metaphors and similes that either contradict each other or are just saying the same thing again and again. A single paragraph describing her grandmother and her posthumous existence, where it describes her as cold and frigid and frozen and cold again over and over again, as if we couldn't get it the first or second or third time. But the writing is still sort of on par. The main issue I have is that this protagonist has nothing going on. I feel like she has one distinguishing trait, and that is it. And that trait is that she doesn't talk, other than the fact that she is paler and skinnier than her cousin, which we are reminded of constantly. Her one thing is that she doesn't talk. And while that could be really interesting, I mean, I don't think it would ever be interesting if that was literally all that she had going on, which is the case in this book, in my opinion. But it could be interesting that she has chosen to be silent. I feel like there are moments where Ava Reid almost reaches something interesting about silence and the many facets of it, but I just also find it mind-numbingly tedious to follow a protagonist who only has one distinguishing trait. There's nothing else going on for her. She thinks about her grandma a lot, refers to her grandmother's posthumous existence a lot. She compares herself to her cousin, and other people compare her to her cousin. She swans over the hot guy that she's seen 4 or 5 times. She thinks about food a lot and other people's bodies. She doesn't have anything else going on. She's a very boring character. And I don't hate her. I don't dislike her. I just feel that there isn't enough about her to feel any way about in any direction. She is so bland. She is so boring. And I won't spoil the ways that the character development and the relationships shift in this section. I will save that for my spoilers, but the way that things developed actually made her more boring, if that's even possible. So there's that. Let's talk about genre for a second, because to me, so far, this is 100% romantasy. I don't know who out there is saying this isn't romantasy. It is a fantasy that barely spends any time on the world building, the magic, anything that makes it different from the real world. Everything is very vaguely gestured at. It is dark, but sort of as an aesthetic blanketed over everything, and that's it. I couldn't understand any world where someone would call this horror, truly. And I'm not saying that to I'm not trying to be harsh to people who are framing this differently. I just don't get it, literally at all. Everything about this reads like romantasy to me. All the tropes read like romantasy. The way that the romance is written reads 100% like romantasy to me. The tone of it is very morose and bleak, but that doesn't make it not romantasy. Just because this character isn't having sarcastic quipping matches with everyone around her doesn't mean that she isn't a romantasy MC. She also is such a not like other girls main character and insta love. And the man she's into is gigantic, like a skyscraper. It's romantasy. I don't know how else to say it. I don't understand the kerfuffle, to be totally honest. Maybe 2 pages from now, it goes full on horror. I will be like, oh yeah, there's the horror. Everything is different now. But so far, up to this point, this is 100% a romantasy. A dark and dreary romantasy, sure. I guess we'll find out. Now, is there some violence, death, blood, body horror, gore stuff going on? Sure. It's not nearly as frequent as I was expecting based on how people are talking about it. Again, maybe the second half just is unhinged. But it's really not that much. Even the most disturbing element, which I will talk about in the spoiler section, that I assume a lot of people are reacting poorly to and definitely should have a content warning, still was not vividly described at all. It was not graphically described. We didn't witness it in the moment. We didn't experience it in the moment. It was mentioned in passing, hinted at a couple times, and then sort of described kind of quickly and then moved on from. Is it a disturbing concept in general that people should definitely be warned about because it's something people might be really upset to think about? Sure. Yes. Again, I'm the person advocating for content warnings all the time on every book that people can opt into if they need them or want them. So yes, I think so. I can see why people would be upset coming across that content just out of nowhere, but I also don't think it was very graphic at all. And I am someone who is pretty sensitive to that kind of content, or sort of content in that realm of potentially upsetting content, that category. And I didn't personally find it upsetting because it was so briefly described and moved on from very quickly. It made me scrunch up my face and say, what the fuck, out loud, but I didn't get upset about it. I can understand why people would think, what? Why? Why is that in here? Huh? Because, yeah, I don't know. It doesn't seem like it has to be, but there is other violence, there is other blood. Again, I've read a lot of fantasy, I've read romantasy that has blood and gore and descriptions of people being murdered in a bloody way, or someone slowly decaying and decomposing and gross stuff happening with their bodies. A lot of fantasy, including romantasy, has wars and battles and sudden shocking murders and things. So I wouldn't say that most of the scenes in this and the events in this are particularly out of the realm of what one could expect from fantasy and romantasy. That being said, I do still think that the content deserves a warning, but I also don't think the content is particularly graphic or disturbing in general, and I also don't think that there is enough disturbing, terrifying, awful content for this to automatically be considered horror. So those are my thoughts. I'm going to keep it simple because I really feel like a lot of the things I want to complain about are spoilers, and I also just don't want to be too repetitive and go over the same things again that I already complained about. I'm sure I'll have more things to complain about as I continue further into the book. So I'm just going to do a quick spoiler section to talk about character and relationship development, and also the potentially triggering, potentially upsetting content that happened in this section, and the specific thing that I think is probably what people are reacting to. And then I will go away and read to 75% and see if we get a sudden shift into horror all of a sudden in book 2. I don't know. I have seen at least one review where the reviewer said that the first part of the book was more gory and graphic than the second part. And if that's true, then I really don't understand people calling this horror and saying it's horrifically graphic and gory. But I have also seen people say that the ending is absolutely off the wall and disturbing and disgusting. So I don't know who to believe. Again, that's why I'm reading it myself. So we'll find out. But first, I'm going to talk spoilers. So spoilers now for the first half of Innamorata. If you don't want to be spoiled, don't watch this. Skip it. Use the chapters down below to skip to the end. Have you skipped it? Okay, so basically, starting with character development and relationship development, because I'm going to try to be quick about this. Sorry, there's a moth and it is distracting me so much. It's flying in like figure 8 patterns. What are you doing? Chill. Just chill, please, sir. Sir. Anyway, so character development and relationship development. So relationship development first, I guess. No, I'll do both together because they're linked. So basically, Agnes, our protagonist, gets tortured by the terrible king, who we all know is terrible because we are told over and over again, and also because he's described as being grotesquely overweight, because this book is fatphobic. So anyway, the king, who is evil personified, decides to get everyone to pledge allegiance to him, to be very clear and verbally say that they think he is a great king. And he goes around to every person and he finally gets to Agnes and she doesn't answer because she doesn't talk. And he tries to get her to talk and she won't. So he stabs her through the hand and she still doesn't make a sound, doesn't talk. So he has her pinned to the table and he stabs her hand again and again and again until her hand is like a bloody mess of pulp. And she still doesn't say anything, which makes him very angry. Because he's now pissed off at Agnes, and just in general, evil personified, he decides to send Agnes away to marry the, I don't know if we know exactly how old he is, but at least late middle-aged head of the House of Blood. And she was supposed to never get married. That was one of the things she promised to her grandmother. We also learn in this section that the moment that she stopped speaking was the moment that her grandmother asked her if she would pledge herself to basically do whatever her grandmother wanted to fulfill her grandmother's wishes. And she said yes. So then she was pinned to the table and had rules to follow for her life carved into her stomach for some reason, as if she couldn't remember them if you just told her. I don't really understand the point of the scarification of just like lists of don't have sex. I mean, it's worded more fancily, but it's basically don't have sex, don't eat rich food other than watered down wine and bread. I don't know how all this fits on her stomach. There's like multiple rules. Guard your maidenhood right above her bits. She's supposed to be a pretty thin person. I don't know how there's enough space for this. Maybe whatever kind of writing they use is more like character based and so they could actually fit more. But also we know nothing about this world, so who knows what kind of writing they have. I don't know. I think we know that there's a different language spoken by the people who are also kind of not human, but we also have no answers for how that works, from which sexy hot prince comes across the water. Anyway, she has the rules for living her life carved into her skin. And through that pain of having this forced scarification, she stops making a noise, she stops crying and whimpering and asking them to stop at some point, and then she just never speaks again. So that's what happened. She doesn't speak, but she promised her grandmother that she would never have sex. And that was really important to her grandmother for some reason. We're not told why, it's just important for some reason. So she's not happy with this idea of being married off. She's not supposed to be married off. And to make it a better deal, the king takes away the title of Mistress of Teeth from her cousin and gives it to her. Plus, technically, she's 5 days older, so she could be Mistress of Teeth depending on which, rules of inheritance you follow. Even though her cousin was the first daughter of the first daughter, she was also the eldest. Anyway, she becomes Mistress of Teeth. She's sent off to marry the Master of Blood. And she gets there and he's actually like a really sweet guy. She's really surprised. He is much older than her, but he seems genuinely kind. He's actually very handsome. And his court, despite being named after blood, is actually like light and airy and fun and happy. And she suddenly sees a future where she can actually be joyful and she can get married and she can have a life and she can have a loving husband. And they get married and have a feast, and she drinks unwatered down wine for the first time and has food that isn't just bread without butter for the first time in ages. And she's really living it up. She's having a great time. Her husband shows up before the wedding to give her a flower crown to wear in her hair and just seems like actually kind of excited about this and sweet. And she's looking forward to it. And of course, nothing could be happy and peppy for too long in this dreary world. So as soon as the wedding and the feast is over and they're heading back to their bedroom for the wedding night, his adult son shows up and viciously murders his dad in front of Agnes. So Agnes, cradles her new husband's body as his intestines fall out and he dies a bloody death. And because of the fear as the son turns his dagger on her, and also just anguish at this hope she'd started to feel budding within her disappearing, she screams for the first time in a very long time and calls out the name of her golden lover boy prince, who shows up and imprisons the son. He didn't even try to run away or pretend he didn't do it, which seems odd to me. I'm not sure how he thought this would turn out. I guess he thought that she wouldn't say anything or make a noise because she doesn't speak, but also thought she wouldn't run away and couldn't tell anyone what happened. I don't know. I guess he thought he was going to murder her too and it would all be very easy and she wouldn't react at all. It seems like he hadn't thought out this plan. Anyway, she yells and screams, and now that she's broken that seal, I guess, she just talks again. No repercussions from not talking for about a decade. Her voice isn't hoarse. She doesn't need time to recover her ability to speak. She doesn't have, a quieter voice. She doesn't need breaks. She doesn't feel even psychological effects or discomfort with hearing her own voice. We don't even have a moment of her being surprised at the sound of her own voice after all this time. Literally nothing. She's just talking again now, and it's normal and fine. Which is what I'm saying about character development going one step forward and two steps back, because we finally get an inkling of something interesting with her where she actually has hope for a future severed from her grandmother's posthumous existence, where she could be her own person and maybe find joy, which she never thought she could have, and then it's taken away from her. And that could be interesting. That could be like a villain origin story, but instead, the only thing that made her interesting before, which was the fact that she didn't talk, is now gone with zero repercussions, zero adjustment period, zero anything remotely realistic about how this would actually work. And she's also just like back to baseline, very bland. She doesn't seem all that sad about what happened, but she also doesn't seem sad about losing the hope she had. She just is back to like totally bland, mellow, no emotion whatsoever, no reaction to anything. Agnes. Good old Agnes, except now she talks. So there's that. And then relationship development wise, she's in the bath trying to wash off all the blood from herself after, her husband being murdered in front of her. And hot golden prince dude shows up and they have sex, because of course they do. Within hours at most, since she watched her husband be murdered viciously in front of her, she is losing her virginity to her cousin's husband, and doesn't seem to have a single thought of regret or remorse or guilt over doing this, even though she seemed to actually think her husband seemed like a cool guy. Doesn't have a moment of guilt or remorse as far as I can tell about it being her cousin's husband either. Also, this way the scene is written is so strange to me and has so many romantasy tropes, again, of like gigantic guy. Yes, his member is described and it's huge. She doesn't go quite as far as thinking, how is that going to fit? But you can fill in the blanks. We also get a weird moment where she's like, I'm not the virginal Agnes anymore. And like, okay, yeah, that's what, I mean, yeah, you're having sex, so you're not going to be a virgin anymore. But also like, it's weird. It's weird. The vibes are weird. I recently read another book where a character loses... I'm laughing because it's unbelievable, and I can't believe I had to read it once, let alone twice, in such a short period of time. But I read another book recently where a character's spouse dies, and within hours they're having sex with someone else. And I'm just thinking, pardon? I'm sorry. I know grief does a lot to a person. I know trauma can show up in many ways, but what are you doing? Please. 24 hours at least? No waiting period. Okay. They punish the son by walling him up so that he can starve to death in the wine cellar of blood, because there's a wine cellar of blood We get no world building. What are they doing with it? I don't know. Do they drink it? Are they vampires? I don't think so. We actually have no idea. Why are they keeping all the blood in casks? We don't know. Agnes thinks it's very clever of her late husband for some reason. Why is it clever? I don't know. They waterboard him with blood for a bit. Anyway, moving on. They decide to go back to the castle now. I don't know why Agnes can't stay. Wouldn't she technically be mistress of blood now because she was married to the master, the head of the House of Blood? I guess not. So they're leaving now. And then they get back and it turns out that everyone's pretty pissed about what happened. And the wife of the son was from the House of Eyes. So now the House of Eyes is also pissed off because her husband was killed. So even though he murdered his own dad in cold blood, so like what else was supposed to happen? I don't know. But so now both the House of Blood and the House of Eyes are kind of on the fritz with the king. So he, at the very end of the first half, very dramatically claims, as if this is some like big terrible punishment, I don't know, says that his son and Agnes's cousin are going to have a child when they have a girl, which will hopefully be soon. And ideally their first child will be a girl so that they can do this lickety split. She will be betrothed to the grandson of the Master of Blood who was murdered, who will be the next in line, and they'll get married. And that way everyone will be happy again. And that's framed as like some huge torture, some terrible fate. And I'm just thinking, okay, considering how this seems to work, and considering one of the few things we know about this world is Agnes saying that almost no one ever feels happy or smiles on their wedding day, presumably arranged marriages are very normal. I don't know why they're shocked by the idea that A, they would be expected to consummate their marriage and produce children. That seemed to be expected already, and that whatever children they have would probably be placed in arranged marriages. Like, I don't know why that's framed as like an even worse fate than what's already happened. And that's how Agnes reacts. I think she literally thinks that she couldn't have imagined a worse fate for her golden prince boy. But of course, his evil father could think of something, and the fate is, please produce an heir with your wife, which was already an expectation. Anyway, that's the character development. And then in terms of bloody, gory, terrible things that happen, like I said, her relatively nice seeming new husband is murdered. He's stabbed a few times, disemboweled, has his throat slit. You know, not great, but also not described in too much visceral detail. Like, yes, it's described, but again, it's described in like the most sparing detail you could have to still know what's happening. It's not like it's super, super gory and graphic. We get the scene of her having the rules carved into her stomach. I keep thinking of that one Dua Lipa song. What is that song called? New Rules or something? Anyway, does not fit the tone of this book or that scene at all. But anyway, the idea of it is not great. It's not that long of a scene and it's not that graphic. The thing that I think people are probably most upset about is that it turns out that Agnes's mother had another child hooked up with a random serf, and grandma was not happy about it, or her mom was not happy about it. And that was not acceptable in the first place, but also the child she bore was a son. And we have learned one of the few things we know about this world and about the House of Teeth specifically is that they're not allowed to have sons. There have been no sons born since grandma took over. Things are passed down to the daughters. And we learn that Agnes's mother gave birth to a boy, and Agnes's grandmother made sure the baby did not survive. And slowly over a period of chapters, several chapters, we learn, it trickles out details. We end up learning how the baby is killed. And yes, the way it's described, again, it's pretty brief. It's a couple sentences and that's it. But yeah, the way the baby died was not great. I probably shouldn't describe it because I feel like this video will be flagged, but it's, you know, it's not a great way to go for anyone, let alone an infant. Do I like the idea of reading about infants dying in general, let alone dying badly in a terrible way? No. Again, is it described in detail? Not really, no. And then it's also implied pretty heavily, and then later on basically confirmed, that Agnes was forced to at least eat a little bit. So there's a little bit of cannibalism. Should there be content warnings for these things? Yes. Are the concepts here pretty disturbing? Yes. Is it actually described in a graphic, gory, disturbing, bloody, body horror type of way? No. It is described so quickly in passing. It is mostly hinted at and then very briefly explained and then moved on really fast. It is not in detail. It is not graphic. It is not gory in how it's described. If this were a horror novel, it would be described in more detail. It just would. Could I understand why someone who never reads horror and maybe focuses on fantasy and romantasy might not have come across a book that has this kind of content in it before? Yeah. So I could understand being surprised. I don't think, again, that it was nearly as graphic as people are making it out to be, unless, again, the second half does a lot of things that have not happened in the first half. But there should 100% be content warnings for that. Like, come on. That's pretty... Not everyone wants to read about that, even quickly in passing, even a few sentences dedicated to it. Not everyone wants to invest in reading almost 600 pages about a protagonist who willingly or not cannibalized her infant brother. Like, I could understand people wanting to give it a pass. I think it's fair to want to be warned, even outside of the fact that, like I've said a million times already in this video, I think all books should have content warnings anyway. And if you're gonna write this kind of content, I feel like the bare minimum is just having a list somewhere with the content so people can be informed if they want to be. Like, come on. I can imagine some people, and maybe even myself a couple years ago before I started reading horror, maybe I would have read this and been really upset by it. And I could have seen myself, especially reading this maybe as a teen, if I'd come across this book, or in my early 20s, having nightmares about that scenario. It's pretty disturbing, even if it's not described in detail, and some people have more vivid imaginations than other people. And that's not even remotely touching on people who might have legitimate, real trauma or have experienced the loss of an infant. I can't imagine reading this if you have ever experienced that kind of grief. So, not that graphic and gory. I still wouldn't call this horror, but yes, I can understand why people would be shocked by that content, and that is why content warnings should exist and be standardized, like I said a million times. That's all that's happened so far. Go away, moth. Just sit somewhere like a normal bug. Just chill. There's nothing else to really spoil. That's it. Yeah, that's all I have to say. I'm gonna go read to the 75% mark. Honestly, I might just read right to the end. If it continues to be this slow paced, I might not have anything to say at the 75% mark that I haven't already touched on. I might just push through, get to the end, and then share my final thoughts. You can probably tell so far, I'm not super impressed by this book in general. I don't think the quality is all that great. Very little is happening. I don't find the characters particularly compelling. And again, to me, it just reads like pretty standard run-of-the-mill romantasy with some more dark content thrown in for the vibes, I guess. I don't really understand the controversy so far, other than agreeing that in general, content warning should be standard, and also if you are going to write this kind of dark content into your books, even if you aren't writing it in a particularly graphic way, I do think people deserve the chance to be warned, to inform themselves, and to decide if that's the kind of content they want to consume. Reading is a hobby. Reading is for fun. People spend their hard-earned money and their very limited free time reading these books, and they deserve to be able to make a choice about what they want to consume and what they don't want to consume. I don't love this almost entitlement that authors seem to have, where they feel that they should be able to write whatever they want and like they shouldn't have to own up to it or tell anyone ahead of time what kind of book they're writing. They should be allowed to portray it however they like and hide whatever kind of content they want inside. And if people are upset, too bad, because that's their creative freedom. And it's like, yeah, you can write whatever you want, but also it's fair for people to want to know ahead of time. You shouldn't get to just trick people into reading whatever depraved thing pops into your head just because you feel like it. You can write it, but people don't have to read it. And also people should be allowed to decide for themselves if they want to read it and not be like roped into whatever strange thing you want to write. And this isn't about Ava Reid specifically. This is about all authors who write dark, disturbing content in their books and then throw a hissy fit when people ask them to include content warnings. Like, I don't know. I feel like if you want to talk about really dark stuff, you should probably have to warn people that your books have really dark stuff in them as just a trade-off, so that people who actually would rather read something without really dark stuff because they only have the time and money to read one book a month or something, and they know that reading something really dark is actually going to kind of ruin their day or week or month or year, depending on how dark it is and how close it is to events they've experienced in their own lives. Maybe they should be able to decide that for themselves, you know? Anyway, I'm gonna go read more of this book. Like I said, I might just read right to the end. I might just push through. So we'll see. I'll be back with some more thoughts tomorrow, and hopefully we'll wrap this up soon because I'm suffering a little bit. Yeah. if you've read this book and you haven't already shared your thoughts, please share them down below. I am so interested in reading more people's opinions on this controversy in general, on the lack of content warnings, on the way that this book is being described, and also just generally on this book as its own thing. I'm kind of confused by it, to be honest. I'm not sure what it's trying to do, but I'm only halfway through. Maybe it will become clear soon. One can only hope. Anyway, I'll be back tomorrow. Goodbye. Yeah. Hi. What is it? Do you want to share your thoughts on the book? Yeah? Come here. Hi. I'm here with Yoda. I finished Innamorata, my friends, and it's not good. I'm going to try to share a bit of a summary, a non-spoiler summary of my opinions of what genre this is, whether it was marketed appropriately or not, and whether it should have had content warnings or not, and a non-spoilery sort of review of the book in general. And then I'm going to get into spoilers because I have a little ranting. I have a little bit of ranting to do, but a lot of it has to do with spoilery things. So Yoda is here to contribute to the gothic moody aesthetic, which is kind of perfect because this book is much more about the vibes and the aesthetic than it is about real substance. I mean, Yoda has a lot of substance. She's a very deep cat. But Innamorata, on the other hand, questionable. Okay, let's start with the genre. Genre-wise, through 90% of this book, it is written like a romantasy. The tone is pretty bleak and dreary, and there are little moments of trying to evoke gruesome world-building elements or moments. Most of those are barely described. Many of them are not actually on the page. Most of the gore and violence is on par with what you would read in your average fantasy or romantasy, with the exception, I would say, of 2 moments. There are 2 moments that are more gruesome and gory than most fantasy and romantasy would lean into, and there's a few more transgressive moments, especially to do with sexuality. That being said, most of it is not explicitly described. Most of it is not actually gory and gruesome on the page. The ideas are upsetting, but they're not really lingered on and not described in detail. I will say, though, that the ending, which I won't spoil for you in the non-spoiler review, does kind of remove romantasy as an option genre-wise, I would say. So I can see why this book wouldn't be explicitly labeled as romantasy. I don't think the ending allows it to be romantasy. And again, I'm not going to tell you what happens until we get to the spoiler section. But while most of the book feels like a romantasy, the ending does lean more into the horror space. I will say that the way that the text shifts into horror at the end feels very unearned and very sudden. And retroactively, the text is trying to apply meaning to it and tie it into themes that are apparently themes that are sort of implied to have been themes that are explored through the whole text, I would beg to differ. Trying to explain why the ending was the way it was and tie it into some sort of greater meaning or theme that the vast majority of this book, literally hundreds of pages, did not depict or explore at all, in my personal opinion. And the wildest thing about it is that there is actually a way that this book, with slight shifts, could have actually depicted the themes that it's saying it's trying to depict, either by shifting around some of the relationships that were being focused on, or actually depicting a more gradual shift in the relationships that were focused on, rather than barely developing them at all for hundreds of pages and many, many years in the timeline of the story, and then suddenly shifting the dynamic with no buildup whatsoever. So genre-wise, I actually think this might have been... Bye, Yoda. So genre-wise, I actually think this might have been accurately described by the publisher. Describing it as a dark gothic fantasy? Yeah, kinda. I still wouldn't fully define it as horror. I would say the vast majority of this book is not horror. It does borrow a little bit from horror, but really, I can't see this being defined as horror particularly, except maybe the last couple chapters. But again, this is an almost 600-page book, so to me, a book that is not horror for hundreds and hundreds of pages and then suddenly becomes horrifying in the last couple chapters still does not a horror novel make. So while I could understand people feeling that there was a bait and switch if they heard it described as just kind of dark romantasy and then read this, the definition of it as dark gothic fantasy to me makes sense. So I actually don't really think this was mismarketed. Was it miscategorized by reviewers? Maybe. But mismarketed? Not really. That being said, I do think the marketing undersells some of the disturbing content, even if most of the content is not actually very explicitly described, even if it's not really that gory or gruesome on the page. I do think that there are enough content warnings, and there are a lot. I'll put the book card on the screen once I finish the spoiler section, so if you're skipping the spoiler section, use the chapters to get to the end of that, and you'll see the book card, because I have written out every content warning that I personally noticed. I'm sure I still missed some, because there are a lot. I do think that several of those content warnings are potentially triggering enough, even if they aren't explicitly described, that they should be warned about and people should go into this book with informed consent in place. And some of them are explicit enough on the page or just a disturbing enough idea that they 1000% should have been warned. I believe all books should come with content warnings. I think it should be a standard. I think people should be able to decide whether they want and need them or not on a book-by-book basis. But I also especially think that books like this, if you want to write transgressive, disturbing content, I think that the bare minimum you owe your readers is to write out the transgressive, disturbing things you wrote into your story in a basic list so that your readers can decide if they want a warning. That feels like the bare minimum to me, personally, especially because as much as I think the genre definition was pretty accurate, it does escalate at the end in a way that does lean into horror, even if the vast majority of the book is not horror. There are two things in this book that happen, one before the beginning of the book, but that is thought about and referenced a number of times, and one in the last few chapters that typically you would not see outside of a horror novel. And I would totally understand people being very thrown off and very shocked and very upset to read that content without having a warning. And I don't know how you warn that without either spoiling those events or being very explicit in the description, saying it is a dark gothic fantasy, but it is more gruesome and transgressive than you might expect. We've included content warnings in a drop-down menu down below. Please check those if you're concerned about potentially transgressive and gruesome content. The Penguin Random House site I was on that had the blurb had drop-down menus at the bottom, like little toggle lists that you could expand that had more info. One of those could have been a list of content warnings, labeled so someone has to opt in by clicking the little triangle to open the menu. And then I think a few more indicators in the blurb of there being transgressive, disturbing content might have been enough to turn some people away who ended up being really shocked and disturbed by the content, which is meant to shock and disturb you, but not everyone reads to be shocked and disturbed. And people can want to read dark gothic fantasy and still not want to read the kind of disturbing, transgressive content that is in this book. Multiple things can exist at once. And I am someone who reads a lot of horror. I read a lot of books that have transgressive, disturbing content. Sometimes I think it's well done, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I think it's well earned, sometimes I don't. In this book personally, I didn't think it was very well earned. Part of that is that I just didn't like this book in general, and I didn't think it was very well executed. Still, the content, for me, felt more about shock value than substance, than message, than theme. And that's something that I'm not personally a fan of. I prefer disturbing content to be there to push the thematic explorations of the text forward. I didn't feel that happened in this book personally. I'm really trying to talk about it in the least spoilery way possible. So that's where I stand on genre. And that's where I stand on content warnings. This should have 100% had content warnings pretty much everywhere that it was being sold. For the most part, how I'm feeling right now is frustrated and disappointed. I felt that the vast majority of this book was filler. I think that hundreds of pages of this could have been cut out and we would have lost nothing. The amount of repetition was literally mind-numbing. It took me much longer to read this than it should have because I had to reread passages because I started checking out because they would just go on long, paragraph after paragraph, descriptions of characters' appearances whose appearances we've had described many times before. We'd have the same character who has known these two cousins for years and years and years run into one of the cousins and go on a multi-paragraph internal monologue about how different they look and how weird it is that they're related because they look so different. Multiple times in the text, this would happen. Same character, same character's perspective on the same other characters who still look the same over and over and over again. We would have our protagonist catch herself in a mirror and think, wow, this is what I look like. Wow, I've changed in this period of time in the same ways that I've described myself changing many times. The number of pages spent on purely physical descriptions of the same maybe 4 characters again and again and again, both individual descriptions and also comparing them and contrasting them against each other, mind-numbing. The repetition in general, not only of specific words and phrases like posthumous existence and quotidian and extinct, expired, forever gone, and the concept of epithets and trying out many different epithets and listing 15 different options for epithets every time you bring up a character. The adjective sharp or sharply or sharper, 69 times. Nice. Bereft, everything is bereft, everyone is bereft, lots of things are barren. The repetition is so excessive. And not only is it repetition on a word-by-word basis, but it's also repetition in the plot, in what's actually happening. The number of times that our protagonist and her secret lover meet up and have sex in the same place, the same kind of sex scene, the same kind of descriptions of what's happening, the same feelings and emotions coming up, the same sort of dialogue between the characters. I don't even know. I stopped counting. The number of times that the king shows up and everyone is viciously fatphobic about the king, and it escalates every time. Stopped counting because it happens so many times. The number of times that we had scenes with Agnes while she was just thinking sadly about all the things she can't have, that are the same list of things she can't have, that she's been thinking about not being able to have the entire book. Again, I stopped counting. The plot is so thin. I genuinely think this book could have been reduced to novella length, maybe even short story length. And again, all the events could have been in this story and nothing would be lost. Literally nothing. You could still have every single thing that happens in this book, every thought, every emotion expressed, every idea expressed. It would just only be said once instead of incessantly. Except that I think the issue with this being a short story or novella would be that without all the padding and the filler, it would be even more obvious how disjointed this is and how little it does to actually build up to the grand finale and how little time it actually spends exploring the themes that it tries to retroactively apply to the text in the last few paragraphs. I genuinely think that the excessive length, the excessive repetition might lull most readers into the sense that something is happening to the point where when the end comes and then you're told what it means, you might think, yeah, that happened for sure. That's why I read hundreds and hundreds of pages, right? When really, no, none of that actually happened on the page. It truly did not. And I'm so frustrated about it because I do think the ideas are interesting. They just were not explored at all. You can't just write a whole book not exploring the themes and then at the end say, and here are the themes, and then call it a day. That's not what a novel is supposed to do. I'm losing it. Okay. Also, the world building is a mess. It contradicts itself. It doesn't make sense. There are so many unanswered questions. Genuinely, it feels like the world building does not exist unless it needs to in the moment, and then as soon as you look away, it disappears again. There was no rich world building. There was no explanation of the political systems. When our cousins leave the land of teeth at the beginning, it's like the land of teeth and all of the presumed peasants that live on their land and also all their servants, household staff, everyone disappears into the ether, never to be mentioned again. There is very little logic to this world. Suddenly at the end, there are a lot of external references to Shakespeare, T.S. Eliot, Nat King Cole. Why? Couldn't tell ya. Doesn't make any sense to me. And while it does have a generally bleak, depressing tone to it, feeling to it, I don't actually think it has that much atmosphere. The setting is not described that much. It doesn't actually have that much in terms of tension and, atmosphere you could cut like a knife. I've read so many books that do it so well. The first book that came to mind when I thought about gothic tension was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. The difference is night and day. So many of the passages, so many of the chapters in this are delivered in a bland way, very bleak and gray tones, but without the actual atmospheric writing. And the writing itself, again, is very layered and very overwrought, but again, often to its own detriment. Stacked similes and metaphors that actually detract from the meaning or confuse the meaning, contradict each other, or just are saying the same thing over and over and over again, which doesn't actually make it hit any harder. It just makes the word count longer. And I do think a lot of the dark content felt like it was there just to be edgy. I'm sorry. I read a lot of dark books. I read a lot of horror. I don't think that dark books are automatically like try hard, trying to be edgy kinds of books, but I do think sometimes I read horror novels too, where I feel that the content is extra dark and depraved just to be like subversive and, ooh, I'm the darkest, most edgy writer you'll ever meet. And this book gave me those vibes. It really did. So much of it had no purpose. And also it felt like pulling punches because, okay, you're going to put some of this content in your book. Sure, go there then. But it almost never went there. Again, there were 2 moments in almost 600 pages where I felt like it went there. One of them was still only like halfway there. It felt like Ava Reid was willing to go far enough to name that really disturbing thing, the first thing that comes up, but not brave enough to actually describe it in great detail because it's disturbing. But if you're going to do disturbing content, then do it, right? I don't know. It's just so odd to me to gesture at it and then run away quickly, move on to the most mundane day-to-day activities and repeating the same physical descriptions again and again about how long and dark Agnes's hair is and how her cousin has nice boobs. Like, we get it. We get it. And then the second event is described in more detail. I do think that with that final event, that one moment near the end, Ava Reid finally went there all the way with the transgressive depravity, with the disturbing content. But again, one time in 600 pages. Everything else is just play acting at darkness and depravity. And then it makes that final moment stand out even more, and not in a good way, because it sort of feels like it came out of left field. Even though so much of this book is play acting at being dark and transgressive and disturbing, the final moment stands out distinctly because it is actually much more disturbing and much more graphically described than anything else. And that makes it feel out of place, even though the whole book wants you to think that it is that. But I feel like the fact that that ending stands out so much is the greatest proof that the rest of the book actually isn't that dark or gruesome or disturbing. Then also, I think that they should serve a purpose. And I think the vast majority of the transgressive moments and elements, the disturbing and gruesome elements, most of them did not serve a purpose. The last final one, there was a bit of an effort to retroactively apply meaning to it and tie it to a theme that was not built up to and was not present in the rest of the text. To me, that's not enough. If you're going to make me as a reader read that kind of content that is upsetting and disturbing and gross, then there should be a reason for it. You know? Depravity is not depth. And I feel that about many books that I've read in the last couple of years that I have ended up giving really low ratings that really tried to do a lot of shock value and be really gross without it meaning anything. And to me, depravity on its own isn't depth. I don't get anything out of reading depravity just for depravity's sake. And telling me that the depravity means something is not the same as actually making it mean something in your text, in my opinion. I think the last thing I will say is that the characters here had very little depth. Any character growth that happened very suddenly with no real buildup. What didn't feel earned. We didn't get to watch the growth happen. We didn't get to watch relationships develop or change significantly. Everything always happened like a jump cut. And then it would stay stagnant for hundreds of pages. And then we get another jump cut and something would change. And then it would stay the same for hundreds of pages. And we would constantly reflect on how we're different now. But we never got to actually watch any of that growth or change or degradation happen on the page in real time. And the last thing I'll say is that this book leans very heavily on stereotypes to try to indicate the differences between characters. I have already talked about the fat phobia pretty extensively in other updates. The fat phobia continues right to the end. It gets even worse in some of the scenes near the end, I would say. I think this is one of the most viciously mean-spirited books in terms of fat phobia that I maybe have ever read, and it feels like it's being endorsed by the book itself. Now, that's just my feeling. I'm not saying that Ava Reid is fat phobic. I don't know that. But this book is fat phobic, in my opinion, and really viciously so, in a way that I found really upsetting because it felt deeply cruel. And so unnecessarily so. There are so many other stereotypes that are leaned on in this book as shorthand to tell us how to feel about different characters. Their coloring, whether they're fair and blue-eyed or dark-haired and eyed, is important for characterization, apparently. Whether they are thin or fat is important for characterization, and their morality, whether they are part of the nobility or one of the common people, is important for morality and their intelligence level, according to this book. And there are so many shortcuts to meaning that are leaning on harmful stereotypes. And the one that bothered me the second most after fat phobia was the way that queer characters are depicted in this book. Our main romance is a romance between a cis man and a cis woman, but there are, I would say, two queer relationships depicted on the side. One is more heavily implied and the other one is explicit. And both of them are depicted as deeply toxic, messed up, disturbing, abusive dynamics that we are meant to be disgusted by. And then the one straight pairing, while it isn't perfect, and there is an attempt to sort of depict it as more complex than it actually is and darker than it actually is, for the most part, in the book, it is treated as a fated soulmate type connection that is endorsed by the universe and God, and actually a very healing, positive, enriching relationship. And I really don't like that. I really don't like how the queer characters are depicted in this book. I really don't like how queer relationships are depicted in this book. There are so few examples of relationships on the page that the difference is startling. And I think even some of the decisions made near the end of the book don't fix it for me. So, yeah, I think that's it. I'm very disappointed in this book. I really disliked it. I felt on a sentence-by-sentence prose level, it was poorly done. I felt the structure and pacing over the course of the novel was quite messy. The world building was almost non-existent. Character development, relationship development, almost non-existent. I think it relied far too heavily on really harmful stereotypes instead of actually doing the work of characterization. I think it skipped over interesting development and then languished in repetition. I think it didn't deliver the atmosphere that it said it would. I don't think it was nearly as dark as it tried to be until it suddenly was without earning it. And I think thematically, it was empty. I didn't feel this book had a purpose. I didn't feel this book was saying anything, and I didn't enjoy my time reading it. If you couldn't tell, I had a terrible time. This is one of the worst times I've had reading a book in a long time. And it's not because it's too dark or disturbing for me, because again, most of the content was actually not that dark and disturbing. I have read much darker. I just didn't enjoy it at all. And I don't think it was well done. And that is just my opinion. If you disagree, you're allowed to disagree. I would actually really like to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments down below. Please be respectful to me, because even if we disagree on our opinions, I think we can be respectful to each other. I am not calling people who like this book anything. You're allowed to have different tastes and opinions than me. You're allowed to read and interpret this differently than me. You're allowed to relate to it in different ways or feel that the way it was depicting characters was not framed in the light that I perceived them to be. You might be able to guess my rating, but I'll leave you hanging till the end of the spoiler section. So skip the spoilers if you haven't read this book. You'll hear my final rating. You'll get to see the book card with all the content warnings listed on it. I might have to do multiple book cards because there are a lot of content warnings, and then we'll wrap this up. But for those of you who have read this, or if you know you're never going to read this and you just want to hear my spoilery thoughts, those are starting now. Full spoilers for Innamorata starting now. This whole book is going to be spoiled, including the very end. So watch at your own risk. Use the chapters in the description box to skip if you don't want spoilers. Okay, and I'm putting this down because it's heavy. So, where do I even begin? I'm not going to cover so many of the things that pissed me off in the second half of this book because I literally would be here for hours and no one needs that. What I will do is address the ending because genuinely, what the fuck? So I already talked about, I'm certain it happened before the halfway point, the one other thing that I think is actively disturbing in this book, which is what happened to Agnes's little brother. The second thing is right near the end, which is that Agnes is murdered and then Leoprand shows up, her hot golden prince boyfriend. At this point, they've gotten married in secret, so he's married to both her cousin and to her, but only married to Agnes in secret. Anyway, they've been married for years now, and he shows up and she's dead, and he's upset, as you would expect him to be. And then the person that ordered her murder orders their henchmen in the room to force Leoprand to have sex with her. Yes, she is dead, and he does. Initially because he's being forced to, and then just gets carried away in the moment, I guess. And it's on the page, and it's described, maybe not as graphically as it could be described, but, you know, pretty explicitly described, I would say. And that's how the book ends. And then it wraps it up in a bow by trying to frame it as a depiction of how love can be corrupted, how love can turn rotten, how it can decay, how it can turn monstrous. And I just think that makes no sense. Because their relationship not only was barely developed, all we know about them is they both like to read. They like to sit next to each other and both read their own book, which is great and all, but like not that much development. And they like to have sex. Again, great. Happy for them. Every sex scene we see is basically the same sex scene. All of them except for one happen in the exact same room. It's the same scene over and over again. And again, happy for them. Reading books together and having sex together, great foundations for a relationship. There is nothing else between them. We are never shown anything else between them. We never see their relationship develop and change over time. The only indication of their relationship going bad or morphing into something more toxic is literally the one time that someone else proposes to Agnes and then is pretty sexist and gross about it and is talking on and on about how she definitely wants to have babies and he could give her babies and isn't that what all women want and what they live for? And she's starting to get a bit upset because she knows herself to be incapable of bearing a child, and Leoprand gets pissed off and beats him to a pulp. Now, is that a bit of an extreme reaction and violent? Yes. It's also totally out of character for him. We have not seen him be violent ever. We saw him mildly torture someone who murdered someone and then basically sentence that person to death earlier in the book. That's not really a pattern of behavior. And one moment of passionate rage and beating someone up, while again, like, don't do that. It was uncalled for, and the person ended up paralyzed. Like, he beat them really bad. He could have killed them. I actually thought he had killed him in that scene, but it turns out the person he was beating up lived. But anyway, like, yeah, it's escalated, but there's no build up to that moment. There's no signs of him getting more and more obsessive and controlling or feeling jealous or his anger getting out of control. And then there's also no other instance of that after that point until the end. But then it's framed like his participation in what started as a forced act at knife point, essentially. Presumably, the threat is that if he doesn't do it, he will be killed. That doesn't mean he should do it, obviously. I'm just saying it's not like he came up with the idea and was excited about the idea and started it himself. He did continue the act on his own. I think maybe it, again, not excusing it whatsoever. I'm just saying that once it's already going, maybe it's some sort of like totally going mad with grief and losing track of what's happening and being in despair. Again, it's a pretty horrific situation. That being said, I don't think that there was any build up to that. And then I definitely don't think that there was any work done through the entire book to frame it as their love went bad. And that's why it happened. And like, went bad why? There were soulmates, but they were engaging in an affair. Is the idea that affairs are bad and you'll be punished for it? Like, what? What are you trying to say? I will read to you one of the lines near the end, which you will recall if you've read this book. I'm sure some people watching this have not read this book and you're just wanting to hear my thoughts, but let me read what it says near the end, where it sort of lays out its thematic thesis here, which again, I don't feel was earned whatsoever. There were but few who would say that this was the work of love, that the prince's passions, some beauteous and others grotesque, were so powerful that they could trespass death itself. Again, the prince's passions were never depicted as anything other than beauteous and very natural and pretty normal and tame until the very end. That was never built up to. We also get this line in the second last chapter. They carried her through the blah, 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 blah. The remains of love corrupted and gone foul. Okay, love decays, I guess. Here was what remained of his once grand and encompassing love. It had been a bright thing, lustrous as the sun itself, and it had painted the world all in gold. Had any saneness remained in him, had he even still the ability to speak, Leoprand might have begged Lord Thrasimund to robe the world once more in its colored vestments, to apply the varnish of passion and romance that made all things charming and luminous again. For without passion's tints and romance's pigments, the world was too repugnant and painful to bear. Again, okay. Sure, love can turn toxic and dark and depraved. Again, not depicted in almost 600 pages. Just suddenly dropped on us at the end. Why? Why do I have to read this? What is the point? What am I getting out of this? Pardon? And the wildest thing to me is that her cousin is right there. Agnes and her cousin have an incestuous adjacent relationship. It is heavily implied that they have sex with each other. It's never on the page because we don't want to go that far, I guess. But it is heavily implied. And they have slept curled together naked since childhood until they get to the castle. They have this very codependent relationship. They are ripe for the taking. If you want to tell a story about love turned obsessive and jealous and corrupt and wrong, start with this relationship that started very pure, where there were two girls basically raised as siblings and closer than twins, and that love over time turned into something more transgressive, that there was this sexual element to it that developed, and then this codependent, obsessive, toxic dynamic, which we never get to see the pure love that it started as. We see that sort of middle ground, but then they break up. They're estranged for most of the book. Again, that very suddenly happens. And then they just basically don't talk for the rest of the book. And that relationship that was ripe for that kind of a journey is just dropped. Okay. And it's heavily implied at the end, if not just outright stated, that her cousin is the one that betrayed them. She found out about their affair. And so she told the Lord of, what is he, the Lord of Eyes, I think? And he proceeds to put this in motion, murder Agnes, and that is framed as revenge for the betrayal on both of their parts. But again, that relationship has just been dropped for most of the book. They have not interacted for the vast majority of the book. They engaged with each other briefly while she was in childbirth, and Agnes was there to hold her hand, and then they immediately didn't talk again for 6 years. Agnes basically raised the boy twin, and her cousin raised the girl twin, and they just never see each other interact that whole time. Her cousin is living in the tower with her handmaiden and her daughter, and they never cross paths. Again, would I have loved the idea of this book deeply leaning into a queer relationship being depicted like something corrupt and messed up and transgressive and disturbing? Not really. I think it could be done well with a lot of care and attention. But to be fair, in the book as it is, queer relationships are depicted that way, because the only queer relationships we see on the page are between Agnes and her cousin, an incestuous relationship that is pretty toxic and messed up and codependent. And then we see her cousin develop a relationship with her handmaiden where there's a power dynamic. It's another toxic, abusive dynamic. And they engage in transgressive sexual acts, not because they're queer, but other transgressive sexual acts, and also having encounters that endanger a child. So, like, it's not like queer relationships are in a good light in this book either. And I honestly don't think that the way this ends suddenly changes the fact that for most of this book, the one straight relationship on the page is depicted as this like glorious golden soul bond that is graced by God and so amazing and perfect and lovely and healing, and that the queer relationship Agnes managed to escape was this transgressive, toxic, messed up dynamic that she's so happy to be free from finally. Like, it doesn't fix it that in the end also the straight relationship was doomed to fail. But again, we had a relationship that was built to have that dynamic that could have explored this theme throughout the entire book, but it was just dropped. So we even get the layer that Moroza, Agnes's cousin, dresses her new handmaiden Ninian basically up as Agnes. Like, she dresses her in the same colors Agnes used to wear. She styles her hair in the same way. It seems like she has this really obsessive feeling about Agnes, and in the end it almost feels like she is more upset by Agnes's betrayal than her husband's betrayal. The way it is written in this book feels like a pretty crappy stereotype about queer women, but also ties into the themes that apparently it seems Ava Reid was trying to explore, but again is just tossed away in favor of this very bland het relationship where we see no development and there is no growing obsession or corruption over time. It's just totally happy-go-lucky, having sex by candlelight every night for years and years and playing family, to suddenly depravity and despair. Okay, divine punishment for them having an affair, I guess. Weird message, but sure. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to get out of that, and I'm not sure how to not be super disappointed by the thrown away potential with some of these other relationships and characters, and the fact that an interesting theme was just slapped on at the end instead of actually explored. And then the book ends with Agnes tossed in a crypt and telling us that she is pregnant, that she is dead, but somehow her corpse is pregnant. And that's the end of the book. Why? Why? Why were we not allowed to experience any actual character development, any growth? Why were we not allowed to watch any of these dynamics shift and change? Why were we not allowed to be a part of anything interesting happening ever? I cannot. And like, I don't know even how to articulate it, but I am very turned off by the amount of narrative focus there is on Agnes being unable to conceive, on being unable to bear a child, being barren, as she often describes herself, only for the book to end with her dead but pregnant. Like, it feels like Agnes and the prince are being punished for their affair by the narrative. And I feel like that's not what the book is trying to do, but that's kind of how it comes across. Like, how dare you try to find joy together and play house and play like you have this little family and get married in secret. I'm going to destroy and ruin and deface and debase your love and also your dream of being parents together, you know? And like, where is this sequel gonna go? Because this is supposed to be a duology. Are we gonna follow the corpse baby? Pardon the bluntness, but genuinely, like, what? Okay. I have zero interest. When Agnes was murdered, not only was I not shocked, but I also did not care at all. Nothing about this book made me care about Agnes as a person. She was so one-dimensional. We are told that she's smart, but she makes many dumb decisions. We're told she's beautiful a lot in her own way. Great. We're told she loves Leoprand a lot. Great. That's it. That's it. The only thing that was an extra or interesting trait about her was her willful decision to be silent for the first half of the book, but then that is just undone in a moment, and there's no repercussions and there's no adjustment period, and she just talks again. Honestly, by the time I got to the end of the book, I forgot she ever didn't talk. That's how much it became irrelevant. Nothing about this book made me care. The only shocking part to me was that ending, in part because it felt so out of place, even though this book, again, frames itself as being so dark and disturbing and tries to really lean into that aesthetic. It's not actually very dark most of the time, and it's very non-graphic, and then the ending is just out of left field. It also doesn't make sense, characterization-wise. Anyway, it kind of feels like this book is Groundhog Day. And we just do the same thing again and again and again and again and again, and then suddenly things explode, and it's over. And I just feel like whiplash. Most of it feels like romantasy wearing a dark gothic literary costume, but it's the costume is from Shein. And then the ending is just like ripped out of a horror novel and shoved in here without any buildup and without it tying to anything and just being totally disconnected from what the rest of the book is doing. And then it's over. Okay. This is heavily focused on the aesthetic and shock value, and it chooses aesthetic and shock value every time over narrative progression, character development, relationship development, cohesive world building, or really any substantial world building at all, and any meaningful thematic exploration. I think the way the ending is framed is trying to set it up as the inevitable outcome of their relationship. There was no way they could have had a happy ending. And perhaps that's true in this world. But again, we don't know enough about the world to really feel that that's true. And also, again, it's not built up to at all. Why did we languish in the same day again and again and again in the middle? It didn't do anything. There was no progression. There was no development. And I feel like my review is so repetitive because the book itself is so repetitive. There's only so much to say because it's the same things again and again and again. I think Moroza is maybe the most interesting character, but she's barely on the page, especially in the second half. Content like there being a random homeless man who is brought in because he's disposable to do things for the prince to set up a surprise for Agnes. Turns out that he betrays them at the end because he's actually not as stupid as they thought he was, even though they keep repeating that peasants are very stupid, because they're very classist. But also, he just is described as loving to eat all the like waste products, all the things that people normally don't eat when they eat animals. There's a scene of him for some reason eating from the rubbish pile in the kitchen, and two people betting on how much of it he'll eat, and then one of them going to catch one of the kitchen cats and seeing if he'll eat it, and he does. The cat is alive, by the way, because why not? Again, what is the point? This character is not important to the story. The character is not adding anything to the story. Anything gross related to this character is doing nothing for the story. It's just there. Why? Why is it there? I don't know if Ava Reid could answer that question. I mean, I'm sure she could come up with an answer if pressed. But as a reader, for me, it doesn't feel like it's adding anything. It feels like it's gross and subversive just to be gross and subversive. Why do we watch a full-grown woman breastfeed from another full-grown woman with a child in the room? Could be tied to themes. Is it actually, though? No. It's just a one-off moment that's meant to shock us, and then we move on. Okay. I'm tired. I'm tired. Again, I read a lot of books with dark content. I read books with subversive content. I don't think it's inherently useless in literature. I just think it should actually serve a purpose in literature, and I don't feel that it did here. I felt that this book was very poorly crafted in general. I felt it was laborious to get through. I am tired and annoyed, and I feel like I wasted my time on hundreds of pages of filler and repetition only to be smacked over the head with grossness for no reason. And it wasn't even fun at any point throughout. I didn't care about the characters. I wasn't having a good time. I didn't think the atmosphere was interesting or spooky. The world building made no sense. What was the point of any of that? So anyway, just like this book, I am going in circles. So I'm going to stop. Those are the spoiler thoughts that I could manage to share. Again, share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've read this book. I want to know what you thought. I am baffled, to be honest. This makes no sense to me. I have zero plans to read any more Ava Reid ever, to be honest. Did not have a fun time. So unless you couldn't tell, considering how I've been talking about this book, this was a 1-star read for me. I genuinely hated this. I thought it was so poorly done. Nothing about it appealed to me, and I feel like it was a giant waste of my time. So here's the book card. If you want more details, if you want to see all the content warnings that I noticed while reading, there you have it. If you have specific questions about any of these content warnings, especially if you didn't watch the spoiler sections, but you want to know to what extent these content warnings exist, leave a comment down below and I will try to specify for you or clarify for you. There is no way, in my opinion, that this book should exist without content warnings available from the publisher, printed in the book, and also on any pages where this book is being promoted or sold, to be totally honest. Again, if you're writing this kind of content, you're allowed to, totally. Should you warn people about it more explicitly in the blurb? Yes. And should you give people the chance to look at content warnings directly from you because you decided to write a book with this content? I think yes. Again, I've said that a million times. I think that should exist in general for books. I think to move in that direction. No, I don't think people should use it to send death threats or to censor books or to try to ban books. Stop that. Stop it. But yes, we should do it because we should care about readers and trying to allow readers the choice about what they read and when, and what they spend their time and money on, and protecting their mental health so they're not exposing themselves to content that they don't feel prepared for or just are uninterested in reading. It's okay to not want to read content like the content in this book. That is fine. Just because someone wants to write it and some people want to read it does not mean everyone wants to read it. And again, I generally wouldn't classify this as horror, and it's not being promoted as horror, and I don't think that's inherently a misrepresentation, but I do think this book has much more transgressive, disturbing content in it than most fantasy does, and there are going to be people picking this up who do not typically read horror and are not used to this kind of content, who are going to be very upset by it, and we're seeing that in their reaction. I think being a little bit more clear in the blurb about there being transgressive, disturbing content and having the content warnings available would have solved a lot of these issues. Would it have caused more issues from the few people on the internet who have no chill and will send an author death threats over the content in a book they haven't read? Yes. Will those people freak out about literally anything all the time because they have no chill? Probably yes, unfortunately. That doesn't mean that we just abandon content warnings altogether, in my opinion. Okay, I'm getting worked up. Let me take it down a notch. I think I've said everything I can say. I think I have reviewed this book to the extent that I can without totally going off the rails and getting so ranty that I don't even make sense anymore. I thought about reading a bunch of quotes to you just to depict the level of the writing, but honestly, I could read quotes forever. And most of the quotes I don't even want to read to you because I find them distasteful in the way that they present the content. Just know we get, steel wrapped in silk, like your average romantasy, and we get lots of mooning over how gigantic this love interest is, and lots of other sort of very cliche romantasy tropes in the writing style for the romance, and we get a lot of layered metaphors and nonsensical, viney prose. I did not have a good time with this book. I don't think it's a good book, in my personal opinion. I think it is not being mismarketed as wildly as people are saying. I think the genre is probably pretty accurate. I do, however, think that the ball was severely dropped by not being more clear about the kind of content there is and by including content warnings. I understand people being upset and feeling a bit of a bait and switch, and I do think that's the responsibility both of the publisher and the author, to be totally honest. Again, I don't think that that should result in hate trains and death threats and all kinds of other awfulness, but I do think people expressing their disappointment and their upset at feeling tricked into the kind of book that they weren't interested in reading are valid in their opinions. And I personally didn't enjoy this book in general, even if most of it was not as grotesque and gory as I expected it to be based on how people talked about it. My threshold is maybe different from reading as much horror as I do, but I do think it sort of wandered into pretty grotesque a few times. I don't necessarily 100% agree with every take, but I get why people are upset. I do. And I do think publishers and authors should endeavor to be accurate in how they sell their books, how they portray them. And I think they should endeavor to be more upfront about what kind of content is in their books. I don't think tricking people into reading content that is more explicit or disturbing than they feel comfortable reading is nice. Finding your niche with people who are genuinely interested in the kind of content that you're writing is more sustainable and beneficial long-term anyway. So those are my thoughts on this book and on this controversy. Thanks for watching this very long video. I mean, I imagine it's very long. I haven't finished editing it yet, but future me is probably going to be pulling an all-nighter and very tired and annoyed by how much I talked. Give this video a like if you found it interesting. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you don't have any thoughts, but you just want to let me know you watched this whole thing because you're a real one, leave the emoji that makes you think of this book the most in the comments. I am very curious to see what emoji you will pick for this one. But that's it. Thanks for watching. Thank you again to Foreo for sponsoring this video. If you're looking for the perfect Mother's Day gift or even want to treat yourself, Foreo is having amazing deals right now. Click the link in the description or scan the on-screen QR code. And don't forget to use my code BASED30 for an extra 30% off almost all products. And that code is stackable on sale items too. Thank you again to Foreo for sponsoring this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.